I have a surprise for you. Dad, Marcus said, his hands trembling as he held the envelope that would destroy everything. Clayton Gilbert never imagined that his son's unexpected visit would turn into the most shocking betrayal of his 69 years, threatening to steal the home he'd built with his own hands. What Marcus revealed in that envelope would shock everyone who heard this story. A $280,000 fraud scheme that nearly cost a widowed carpenter everything he'd worked for. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories. Now let's get into it. The alarm clock never had a chance. Clayton Gilbert's eyes opened at exactly 6:30, the same time they had every morning for the past 4 years since Dorothy passed. At 69, his body had developed its own rhythm, independent of mechanical reminders or the need for external validation. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling into another autumn day in Millbrook, Ohio. The gentle creak of old wooden beams, the whisper of wind through the maple trees he'd planted 30 years ago, the distant hum of Mrs. Henderson's coffee maker next door. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, Clayton felt the familiar protest in his knees, a reminder of 45 years spent kneeling on job sites, crawling through attics, and climbing ladders with tool belts heavy enough to anchor a small boat. But these aches were honest aches earned through decades of creating beauty, with his hands transforming raw lumber into heirloom furniture and restoring forgotten treasures to their former glory. The kitchen welcomed him with the comfortable embrace of routine. He measured coffee with the precision of a craftsman, 2 level scoops, no more, no less, and set the ancient percolator on the stove. While waiting for the familiar bubbling symphony, he unfolded the Millbrook Gazette, scanning headlines about the upcoming Harvest Festival and the high school football team's chances at the regional championship. Small-town news, but it was his town, and these details mattered in ways that CNN could never understand. Coffee in hand, Clayton stepped onto the back porch, breathing in the crisp October air that carried hints of wood smoke and the earthy sweetness of fallen leaves. The weather looked perfect for workshop time, cool enough to work comfortably, but warm enough that his arthritis wouldn't seize up his fingers. Mrs. Henderson's antique chair was waiting for him, a 1920s piece, with intricate spindle work that had been neglected for decades, but still held the bones of exceptional craftsmanship. In his workshop surrounded by the tools that had fed his family and built his reputation, Clayton felt the peace that came from purposeful work. He ran his calloused palm over the chair's surface, feeling imperfections that untrained hands would miss. The wood whispered its secrets to him, where moisture had warped the grain, where careless handling had left scratches, where time itself had worn down the finish to reveal the honey-colored oak beneath. As he began the meditative process of sanding, starting with coarse grit to remove the damaged finish, Clayton's mind wandered to Dorothy. She used to bring him coffee in the workshop, settling into the old rocking chair he'd made for their first anniversary content, to watch him work while sharing neighborhood gossip or reading aloud from her latest library book. The workshop felt emptier without her gentle presence, but her influence remained in every careful stroke of his sandpaper, every patient measurement, every refusal to rush a job that deserved his full attention. Pausing to examine his progress, Clayton's gaze fell on the framed photograph mounted above his workbench. Dorothy radiant in her wedding dress, standing beside him in his only suit, both of them impossibly young and optimistic. Next to it, a more recent photo showed the 3 of them at Marcus's college graduation, Dorothy beaming with pride, Clayton's arm around his son's shoulders, Marcus looking uncomfortable in his cap and gown, already eager to escape to what he considered more important pursuits. The memory brought the familiar ache of regret. Dorothy's final words echoed in his mind, "Take care of our boy Clayton. He'll find his way back to us." She'd said it during those terrible 2 weeks in the hospital, when the stroke had left her weak, but still hopeful, still believing in the fundamental goodness of the son who visited twice, once when she was admitted, once for her funeral. The workshop phone's shrill ring shattered his reverie. Clayton glanced at the caller ID, surprised to see Marcus's name. His son rarely called during the week, and never this early. Their conversations had become predictably brief over the years, holiday obligations and occasional requests for money, each interaction leaving Clayton feeling more like a bank than a father. "Hello, Marcus," he answered, settling the receiver against his ear while continuing to hold the sandpaper. "Dad, hey, I'm glad I caught you." Marcus's voice carried an unusual energy, an excitement that Clayton hadn't heard in years. "Listen, I know this is short notice, but Vanessa and I want to come by tomorrow morning. We have something special to share with you, a surprise." Clayton frowned, his craftsman's instincts detecting something off in his son's tone. The eagerness felt forced, like a salesman's enthusiasm or a politician's promise. A surprise. What kind of surprise? I can't tell you over the phone. Marcus laughed, but the sound carried a nervous edge. It's something we need to discuss in person. Something that's going to change everything for all of us. Trust me, Dad, you're going to love this. The phrase, trust me, from Marcus had historically preceded disappointment, but Clayton found himself hoping against experience. Perhaps Dorothy had been right. Perhaps their boy was finally finding his way back. What time tomorrow? Clayton asked, already planning to finish Mrs. Henderson's chair and tidy the house. 10 o'clock. And Dad? Marcus paused, and Clayton could hear muffled conversation in the background. Vanessa's voice sharp with instruction. This is really important. Life-changing, important. I think you're going to be very surprised. After hanging up, Clayton stood in his workshop sandpaper forgotten in his hand. Something in Marcus's voice had triggered an old instinct, the same feeling he got when examining a piece of furniture that looked perfect on the surface but hid structural damage underneath. But Dorothy's photo seemed to smile at him from the wall, reminding him of promises made and hope that refused to die. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight, he had a chair to restore. The sound of an expensive engine purring to a stop outside Clayton's modest craftsman-style home announced his visitor's arrival at precisely 10 o'clock. Through the living room window, he watched a gleaming black Escalade settle into his gravel driveway, a vehicle that probably cost more than he'd earned in his final 2 years of work. The sight triggered a familiar knot of concern in his stomach. Marcus and Vanessa's lifestyle had always exceeded their apparent income, a mathematical impossibility that Clayton's practical mind struggled to reconcile. Marcus emerged from the driver's side, his movements quick and jerky, like a man late for an important appointment. Even from a distance, Clayton could see the nervous energy radiating from his son, the way he checked his phone twice before pocketing it. How his eyes darted toward the house and away again, the forced casualness of his stride that fooled no one who'd raised him from birth. Vanessa took longer to exit the passenger side, her heels clicking against the pavement as she surveyed Clayton's property with the calculating gaze of her real estate profession. Her expression suggested she was conducting an appraisal rather than visiting family. "Dad," Marcus called out as Clayton opened the front door, his voice carrying that same artificial enthusiasm from yesterday's phone call. "Looking good. You've been taking care of yourself." Clayton accepted his son's brief, awkward hug, noting the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask an underlying scent of anxiety-induced perspiration. "Marcus? Vanessa?" He nodded to his daughter-in-law, who offered a perfunctory kiss on his cheek, while her eyes continued their assessment of his home's interior. "Uncle Clayton," she said, though she'd never called him that during their 8-year marriage to Marcus. "Your house has such character. Very authentic period details." Her tone suggested this was not entirely a compliment. Clayton had spent the morning preparing for their visit, dusting furniture that was already clean, arranging Dorothy's good china on the dining room table, and baking an apple pie using his late wife's handwritten recipe. The kitchen still carried the warm scent of cinnamon and nutmeg, a fragrance that had once meant celebration and family gatherings. Now it felt like a peace offering to relatives who rarely offered peace in return. "I made pie," Clayton announced, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Dorothy's recipe. I thought we could have coffee and—" "That's sweet, Dad, really?" Marcus interrupted, his hands fidgeting with the zipper of his leather jacket. "But we're actually on a tight schedule today. Lots to do. Maybe we could just sit down and talk about why we're here." Vanessa had wandered into the living room, her manicured fingers trailing along the mantelpiece, pausing at Dorothy's photograph. "This room could be so much more open if you remove this wall," she mused, tapping the load-bearing beam that separated the living area from the dining room. "Create better flow, more modern appeal." Clayton felt a flash of irritation, but suppressed it. This was Dorothy's house, their house designed and built with careful attention to proportion and function. It didn't need improving, it needed respecting. "Vanessa! Honey, come. Sit down," Marcus called, patting the sofa cushion beside him with more force than necessary. His leg bounced with restless energy, and Clayton noticed a thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool October morning. They settled into an uncomfortable triangle in the living room, Clayton in his familiar recliner, Marcus and Vanessa perched on the edge of the sofa, like birds ready for flight. The silence stretched until Marcus cleared his throat and reached into his jacket pocket. "So, Dad, like I said on the phone, we have something really special to share with you." His voice cracked slightly on the word special, and he coughed to cover it. "Something that's going to benefit all of us, really. A surprise that we think you're going to love." Clayton leaned forward, allowing himself a moment of genuine hope. Perhaps Marcus had finally gotten the promotion he'd been chasing at the insurance company. Maybe Vanessa's real estate career had taken off. Could they be announcing a pregnancy? The possibility of becoming a grandfather had been a secret dream he'd harbored for years. Marcus produced a manila envelope from his jacket, thick with documents and official-looking papers. His hands trembled slightly as he held it, and Clayton noticed his son's knuckles were white with tension. "This represents a new chapter for our family." Marcus continued, his words sounding rehearsed. "A way for all of us to be more secure, more comfortable. Dad, you've worked so hard your whole life, and now it's time for that work to really pay off." The envelope passed from Marcus's shaking hands to Clayton's steady ones. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with more than paper and ink. Clayton's craftsman fingers, accustomed to detecting flaws and imperfections, sensed something fundamentally wrong about the moment, but his father's heart overruled his instincts. "Go ahead, Dad," Vanessa encouraged, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes sharp with anticipation. "Open it." Clayton broke the seal and withdrew a stack of official documents. Bank letterhead, legal terminology, dollar amounts that made his eyes widen. The first page bore the logo of First National Bank of Columbus, and as his gaze traveled down the page, familiar words jumped out at him. Loan agreement. Principal amount $280 dollars. Collateral residential property. And there at the bottom of multiple pages was his signature. Clayton Gilbert, written in his own careful script, repeated again and again on documents he had never seen before. His hands began to shake as the implications crashed over him like a cold wave. This wasn't a gift or a surprise or a new chapter. This was a nightmare written in legal language and secured by the only thing he truly owned, his home. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Marcus and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance, and Clayton saw something pass between them that looked suspiciously like relief, mixed with guilt. "It's simple, Dad," Marcus said, his artificial enthusiasm finally cracking to reveal something desperate underneath. "You took out a loan. For us? For the family. To help us with a really amazing investment opportunity." Clayton stared at the documents in his hands, at his own signature repeated like an accusation at the address of his beloved home, listed as collateral for money he had never borrowed, for purposes he had never approved. The apple pie continued to cool in the kitchen, its sweet aroma now seeming to mock the bitter taste of betrayal that filled his mouth. Marcus and Vanessa had excused themselves for a quick errand, promising to return within the hour to discuss the details. Their hasty departure left Clayton alone in his kitchen, the loan documents spread across the same oak table, where he and Dorothy had shared 40 years of morning coffee and evening conversations. The familiar space felt alien, now contaminated by the presence of papers that claimed to represent decisions he had never made. Clayton's hands had stopped shaking, replaced by the steady focus that had served him well through decades of precision work. He approached the documents with the same methodical attention he brought to restoring damaged furniture, examining each element, carefully looking for the story hidden beneath the surface. The loan agreement bore the letterhead of First National Bank of Columbus, an institution he had never visited. The address meant nothing to him, though Columbus was only an hour's drive from Millbrook. The loan officer's name, Kevin Walsh, was equally unfamiliar. Clayton prided himself on remembering names and faces. In his 45 years of business, he had never forgotten a client or a professional contact. This man was a stranger, but it was the signatures that drew his closest scrutiny. Clayton retrieved his personal documents from the kitchen drawer. His social security card, his driver's license renewal, last year's tax returns, the deed to his house. He spread them beside the loan papers and began comparing signatures with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime noting details that others missed. The discrepancies were immediately obvious to his trained gaze. The signature on his driver's license flowed naturally from left to right, the product of a right-handed man who had signed his name thousands of times. The signatures on the loan documents showed subtle differences, a slight backslant that suggested a left-handed forger attempting to mimic right-handed writing, inconsistent pressure that indicated uncertainty, and most tellingly variations between signatures that no genuine signer would produce. Clayton pulled out a magnifying glass from his workshop toolkit and examined the dates more closely. According to the documents, he had signed the loan agreement on April 15th, with notarization occurring the same day. But April 15th held particular significance for Clayton. It was the date he had driven to Cleveland for the annual Midwest Restoration Materials Expo, a 3-day event he had attended religiously for the past 15 years. Rising from the table, Clayton walked to his desk and retrieved his appointment calendar, a leather-bound book where he meticulously recorded every business meeting, doctor's appointment, and social obligation. There, in his own careful handwriting, was the Cleveland trip, April 13th to 16, Restoration Expo, Cleveland Convention Center, Hotel Marriott downtown. He had even noted the time of his departure and return, along with the mileage for tax purposes. The hotel receipt was still in his filing cabinet, along with photographs he had taken of innovative wood finishing techniques demonstrated at the expo. The timestamps on his digital camera showed him in Cleveland at the exact time he was supposedly sitting in a Columbus bank office, signing documents for a loan he had never requested. Clayton returned to the kitchen table, his confusion crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. This wasn't a mistake or a clerical error. This was deliberate fraud executed with enough sophistication to fool a bank, but not thorough enough to fool someone who understood the importance of details. He examined the loan application more closely, noting other inconsistencies that painted a picture of deception. The application listed his occupation as a contractor, technically accurate, but vague enough to inflate his apparent income. His annual earnings were listed as $85,000, nearly double his actual retirement income from Social Security and occasional restoration projects. The application claimed he had requested the loan for home improvements and investment opportunities, phrases that sounded nothing like his straightforward manner of speaking. Most disturbing of all was the collateral section, which listed his home address. With clinical precision, the property he and Dorothy had purchased as newlyweds, the house he had renovated with his own hands, the only significant asset he possessed. Someone had used his identity, his reputation, and his property to secure money for purposes he couldn't begin to imagine. Clayton's methodical mind began constructing a timeline. Marcus had visited 3 months ago asking for money that Clayton had been unable to provide. Shortly afterward, this loan had been processed. The timing felt far from coincidental, especially given Marcus's obvious nervousness today and Vanessa's calculating assessment of his property value. The sound of car doors slamming in his driveway announced their return. Clayton quickly gathered the documents, his movements deliberate and controlled. 45 years of dealing with difficult clients and challenging restoration projects had taught him the value of preparation and the importance of confronting problems directly. He walked to his living room window and watched Marcus and Vanessa approach his front door, their body language tense with the kind of anxiety that accompanied guilty consciences. Marcus kept checking his phone while Vanessa's usual confidence seemed forced brittle. Clayton straightened his shoulders and returned to his kitchen table, arranging the loan documents, alongside his alibi evidence, the calendar, the hotel receipt, the photographs from Cleveland. The comparison between authentic documents and forged ones told a story that would be impossible to deny or explain away. The doorbell rang, but Clayton didn't move to answer it immediately. He stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal, feeling the weight of a decision that would change his relationship with his son forever. Dorothy's photograph smiled at him from the mantelpiece, and he could almost hear her voice, "Take care of our boy." But sometimes he realized taking care of someone meant refusing to enable their destructive choices. When he finally opened the door, Clayton's face showed none of the confusion or shock that had marked their earlier encounter. Instead, Marcus and Vanessa faced a man who had spent the past hour transforming from victim to investigator, from confused father to determined adversary. "We need to talk," Clayton said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had discovered the truth and was prepared to act on it. Marcus and Vanessa entered Clayton's living room with the forced casualness of people trying to maintain a facade that had already crumbled. Marcus's smile looked painted on, while Vanessa's eyes darted nervously around the room as if searching for escape routes. They settled onto the sofa in the same positions they had occupied earlier, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Clayton remained standing, the loan documents in his hands like evidence at a trial. "So, Dad, have you had a chance to look over everything?" Marcus asked, his voice pitched slightly too high. "I know it's a lot to process, but once you understand the opportunity we're presenting—" "I understand perfectly." Clayton interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent an hour uncovering lies. He placed the loan documents on the coffee table between them, followed by his calendar, hotel receipt, and photographs from Cleveland. "I understand that someone forged my signature on these papers. I understand that someone used my name and my home to secure money I never agreed to borrow." The color drained from Marcus's face as he stared at the evidence arranged before him. Vanessa's perfectly composed expression cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. Dad, you're not thinking clearly, Marcus stammered. You signed these papers. We discussed this back in April. You agreed to help us with an investment opportunity that would benefit everyone. Clayton picked up his calendar and opened it to April. On April 15th, the day these documents claim I was signing loan papers in Columbus, I was actually in Cleveland at the Restoration Materials Expo. He placed the hotel receipt beside the calendar. I have the receipt from the Marriott downtown. I have photographs time-stamped from the convention center. He spread out several pictures showing him examining wood stains and finishing techniques. I was 3 hours away from Columbus, surrounded by witnesses who can verify my presence. Marcus's carefully constructed story crumbled before their eyes. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment Clayton saw not the confident insurance salesman his son pretended to be, but a frightened man who had run out of options. Okay, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Okay, you're right. I forged the signatures. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence, changing everything between them forever. Vanessa shot her husband a look of pure fury. Marcus, what are you doing? He knows, Vanessa. Look at all this evidence. He knows. Marcus buried his face in his hands. Dad, you have to understand. I was desperate. I owed money to people who don't accept late payments. $180,000 to a loan shark named Victor Donovan. He gave me 30 days to pay, and when I couldn't... Marcus looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. He threatened Vanessa. He threatened our future. I didn't know what else to do. Clayton felt his heart break, even as his anger grew. So you decided to steal from me, to risk my home, the only thing I have left of the life your mother and I built together. You never supported my dreams. Marcus exploded, his desperation transforming into accusation. When I wanted to go into business for myself, you told me it was too risky. When I tried to make investments, you called them get-rich-quick schemes. You kept me trapped in that dead-end insurance job, while you sat on this house worth $300,000 doing nothing with it. This house is my home, Clayton replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. Not an investment portfolio, not a bank account. My home. Vanessa had been silent during Marcus's confession, but now she leaned forward with the cold calculation that Clayton had always sensed beneath her surface charm. The money's gone, Clayton. All of it. We used it to pay off Marcus's debts and catch up on our own bills. Even if you wanted to reverse the loan, we can't pay it back. The bank will foreclose on this house within 60 days if the payments aren't made. Her words hit Clayton like physical blows. Not only had they stolen from him, but they had made recovery impossible. The money had vanished into the black hole of their irresponsible lifestyle, leaving him to face the consequences of their choices. You're both criminals, Clayton said, his voice growing stronger with each word. You committed fraud. You forged legal documents. You used my identity to steal money, and now you're telling me it's gone forever. We're family, Marcus pleaded, reaching toward his father. Family helps each other. Mom would have understood. She would have found a way to make this work. The mention of Dorothy ignited something volcanic in Clayton's chest. Don't you dare bring your mother into this. Dorothy spent her last conscious moments asking me to take care of you, and I've been trying to honor that promise for 4 years, but she never meant I should let you destroy me. Vanessa stood up abruptly, her mask of civility finally dropping completely. You're a selfish old man who's going to die alone in this outdated house. We gave you a chance to be part of something bigger to help your family when we needed it most, and you're throwing it all away over paperwork and technicalities. Get out, Clayton said, his voice deadly quiet. Dad, please, Marcus started. Get out, Clayton roared, his composure finally breaking. Get out of my house, both of you, and don't come back. Marcus jumped to his feet, his face cycling through emotions, guilt, anger, fear, and something that looked like hatred. You'll regret this, old man. When the bank takes this house and you're living in some state-funded nursing home, remember that you chose pride over family. I chose honesty over fraud, Clayton replied. I chose integrity over theft. If that means losing my son, then I never really had one to begin with. Vanessa was already heading toward the door, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floor. Marcus followed, but turned back at the threshold. The loan payment is due in 30 days, he said, his voice cold and unfamiliar. Figure out how to make it or lose everything. Your choice. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows and knock Dorothy's photograph askew on the mantelpiece. Clayton stood alone in his living room, surrounded by the scattered evidence of betrayal, listening to the expensive SUV roar out of his driveway and out of his life. The silence that followed felt different from his usual solitude. This wasn't the peaceful quiet of a man content with his own company. This was the hollow emptiness of a father who had just lost his son to greed and desperation, who faced the possibility of losing his home to pay for crimes he had never committed. Clayton walked to the mantelpiece and straightened Dorothy's photograph, her smile now seeming sad rather than comforting. "I tried to take care of him, Dorothy," he whispered, "but some people can't be saved from themselves." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the house he had built with his own hands, the house that now hung in the balance because of signatures he had never written and debts he had never incurred. The silence in Clayton's house felt suffocating after Marcus and Vanessa's departure. He sat in his kitchen staring at the scattered loan documents that represented the destruction of his financial security and his relationship with his only child. The 30-day deadline echoed in his mind like a countdown to disaster. For the first time since Dorothy's death, Clayton felt truly alone and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. But Dorothy hadn't raised a man who surrendered to despair. After an hour of wrestling with his pride and his options, Clayton reached for his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Frank Morrison had been his friend since they were 12 years old, building tree houses in the woods behind Millbrook Elementary. If anyone could help him navigate this legal nightmare, it would be Frank. "Clayton," Frank's voice carried immediate concern. Even in retirement, the former attorney maintained the sharp instincts that had made him one of Ohio's most respected legal minds. "It's past 9 o'clock. What's wrong?" "Frank, I need help." The words came out rougher than Clayton intended, carrying the weight of a man who rarely asked for assistance. "My son has done something terrible, and I don't know how to handle it. I'll be right over." Frank Morrison arrived within 20 minutes, his silver hair disheveled from the evening wind, but his eyes alert and focused. At 71, he moved with the purposeful energy of a man who had spent decades solving other people's problems. He took one look at Clayton's face and immediately shifted into professional mode. "Show me everything," Frank said, settling into the kitchen chair across from his oldest friend. Clayton spread out the loan documents, his evidence from Cleveland, and recounted the entire story from Marcus's suspicious phone call to the explosive confrontation that had ended their relationship. Frank listened without interruption, his trained legal mind processing each detail with the precision that had made him legendary in Ohio courtrooms. When Clayton finished, Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression grim but determined. "Clayton, this isn't just fraud. This is federal fraud. Any bank fraud involving amounts over $100,000 automatically falls under federal jurisdiction. Marcus and Vanessa have committed multiple felonies. Forgery, identity theft, bank fraud, conspiracy. We're talking about serious prison time." "I don't want to send my son to prison," Clayton said quietly. "I just want to protect my home." Frank's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone delivering difficult truth. "Clayton Marcus made that choice when he forged your signature. You're not sending him anywhere his own actions are. And if you don't prosecute, he'll do this to someone else. Probably another elderly person who won't have the resources or knowledge to fight back." The weight of that responsibility settled on Clayton's shoulders. This wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about protecting other potential victims. "I have contacts at the FBI," Frank continued. "Agent Sarah Chen specializes in financial crimes. She's thorough professional, and she understands the impact this kind of fraud has on elderly victims. I can have her here tomorrow morning to start the investigation." Clayton nodded, feeling the first stirring of hope since discovering the forged documents. "What do I need to do?" "Nothing tonight except try to get some rest. Tomorrow we document everything, file the federal complaint, and let the system work. The FBI has resources we can't match: forensic document analysts, banking investigators, the ability to trace financial transactions across state lines." A soft knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Clayton opened it to find Eleanor Hayes standing on his porch, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing an expression of genuine concern. "I saw the lights on late and Frank's car in your driveway," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to caring for others. "I thought you might need some company." Eleanor Hayes had moved to the house next door 2 years ago, a recently widowed librarian from Columbus seeking the peace of small-town life. She and Clayton had developed a comfortable friendship based on shared morning conversations over the fence line and occasional help with household tasks that required 2 pairs of hands. "Eleanor, Clayton began, but she stepped past him into the kitchen, immediately assessing the situation with the sharp intelligence that had made her head librarian at Columbus Metropolitan for 30 years. "Frank Morrison," she said, recognizing the attorney from community events. "If you're here at this hour, Clayton's in serious trouble." Frank quickly explained the situation while Eleanor listened with the focused attention she had once given to difficult research requests. When he finished, She set down her casserole dish and placed a supportive hand on Clayton's shoulder. "You're not facing this alone," she said firmly. "I've seen what financial fraud does to seniors. I helped organize support groups at the library. The community needs to know what happened here, not for gossip, but for protection. If Marcus and Vanessa targeted you, they might target others." As if summoned by her words, Clayton's phone began ringing. Mrs. Henderson from next door, followed by calls from Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, then Sarah Mitchell from the church committee. Word was already spreading through Millbrook's tight-knit network that something was wrong at the Gilbert house. "Let me handle the calls," Eleanor said, taking charge with the natural efficiency of someone accustomed to organizing community responses. "People want to help Clayton. Let them." Frank was already on his own phone, speaking in the crisp, professional tones that had once commanded courtrooms. "Sarah Frank Morrison, I have a federal fraud case that needs immediate attention. Yes, elderly victim, forged documents, bank fraud, over $200,000. Tomorrow morning would be perfect." Clayton stood in his kitchen surrounded by the evidence of betrayal, but also by the growing circle of support that was forming around him. For the first time since opening that envelope, he felt something other than despair and anger. He felt the strength that came from community, from friendship, from people who believed in justice and were willing to fight for it. Frank ended his call and turned to Clayton with satisfaction. "Agent Chen will be here at 9 a.m. tomorrow. She's bringing a forensic document analyst and a banking specialist. The FBI takes elder fraud very seriously, especially when it involves sophisticated forgeries and identity theft." Eleanor had fielded the phone calls and was now organizing what appeared to be an impromptu neighborhood watch. "Mrs. Henderson is bringing breakfast tomorrow morning. Tom Bradley wants to know if you need any security improvements to the house. The church committee is putting together a legal defense fund." Clayton felt overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support. "I can't ask people to—" "You're not asking," Eleanor interrupted gently. "We're offering. That's what community means, Clayton. When one of us is threatened, all of us respond." As Frank gathered up the legal documents and Eleanor organized the community response, Clayton realized that Marcus and Vanessa had made a crucial miscalculation. They had assumed he was just an isolated old man who would be too confused or frightened to fight back effectively. Instead, they had attacked someone who was part of a community that valued justice and protected its own. The federal investigation would begin tomorrow morning, backed by resources that could trace every dollar of the stolen money and every detail of the conspiracy. Clayton Gilbert was no longer a victim standing alone against criminals who had betrayed his trust. He was a citizen with the full weight of federal law enforcement and community support behind him. The 30-day deadline that had seemed so threatening a few hours ago now felt manageable. Marcus and Vanessa had 30 days to enjoy their freedom, because Agent Sarah Chen was about to make their lives very complicated. Agent Sarah Chen arrived at Clayton's house at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, accompanied by two specialists, whose presence immediately transformed his kitchen into a federal crime scene investigation center. Chen herself was a compact woman in her mid-40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of focused energy that suggested she had spent years pursuing financial criminals who thought they were too clever to be caught. "Mr. Gilbert, I'm Agent Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division," she said, shaking Clayton's hand with a firm grip. "This is Special Agent Martinez, our forensic document analyst, and Agent Thompson from our banking fraud unit. Frank Morrison has briefed me on your situation, and I want you to know we take elder fraud very seriously." Clayton found himself surprisingly calm as he recounted his story, once again this time to federal agents who took detailed notes and asked precisely the right questions. Agent Martinez examined the forged documents with equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything Clayton had seen outside of television crime shows, while Agent Thompson began making calls to First National Bank of Columbus. "Mr. Gilbert, these forgeries are quite sophisticated." Agent Martinez observed studying Clayton's signatures under a high-powered magnifying device. "Whoever did this had access to multiple samples of your real signature and spent considerable time practicing the replication. This is an amateur hour. We're looking at someone with either professional training or extensive experience in document fraud." The revelation that this was more than a desperate son's clumsy attempt at forgery sent a chill through Clayton. Agent Chen noticed his reaction and leaned forward, with the kind of reassuring authority that came from years of dealing with crime victims. "The good news is that sophisticated fraud leaves more evidence trails," she explained. "Amateur criminals make simple mistakes. Professional criminals make complex mistakes that we're trained to find. Agent Thompson ended his phone call with a grim expression. "I've got some interesting news from First National. The loan officer who processed this application, Kevin Walsh, has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Apparently, Mr. Gilbert's case isn't the only questionable loan approval on Walsh's desk in recent months." Clayton felt a mixture of vindication and growing unease. "You're saying this Walsh person was working with Marcus?" "We're saying Walsh approved a loan that should never have been approved based on documentation that should have raised multiple red flags," Agent Chen replied carefully. "A retired carpenter with a modest fixed income doesn't typically qualify for a $280,000 unsecured loan, regardless of property collateral. Someone either bypassed standard verification procedures or was paid to look the other way." The federal investigation moved with a speed and thoroughness that amazed Clayton. Within hours, Agent Thompson had obtained court orders for Walsh's banking records, phone logs, and email communications. Agent Martinez had confirmed that the forged signatures showed consistent patterns, suggesting they were created by the same hand, and had identified specific techniques that pointed to someone with access to professional-grade forgery tools. Most damning of all, Agent Chen's team had traced the loan proceeds through a complex series of transfers that painted a clear picture of conspiracy. The $280,000 had been immediately moved from Marcus and Vanessa's joint account into three separate destinations: $180,000 to an account controlled by Victor Donovan, confirming Marcus's claim about gambling, debt $75,000 to various luxury purchases and debt payments, and $25,000 in cash withdrawals that suggested bribery payments. "We've seen this pattern before," Agent Chen explained as she reviewed the financial trail. "Desperate gamblers team up with corrupt banking insiders to create fraudulent loans using the elderly relatives' identities and property. The bank employee gets a cash payment, the gambler gets enough money to pay off immediate debts, and the elderly victim gets stuck with loan payments they can't afford on property they never agreed to risk." By afternoon, the investigation had expanded beyond Clayton's individual case. Agent Thompson's banking audit had uncovered evidence that Walsh had approved at least 6 questionable loans in the past year, all involving elderly applicants with modest incomes who somehow qualified for substantial loans they couldn't realistically service. The pattern suggested a systematic scheme rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. "Mr. Gilbert, we need to prepare you for what comes next," Agent Chen said as her team packed up their equipment. "This case is going before a federal grand jury tomorrow morning. Based on the evidence we've gathered today, we'll be seeking indictments for conspiracy to commit bank fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and money laundering. These are serious federal charges with substantial prison sentences." Clayton felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that justice was finally within reach, sadness that his son had become involved in something so extensive and criminal, and growing confidence that his home and security would be protected by the full weight of federal law enforcement. Frank Morrison, who had remained present throughout the day as Clayton's legal representative, asked the question that had been weighing on everyone's minds. What about the loan itself? Can the bank still foreclose on Clayton's property? "The loan was obtained through fraudulent means using forged documents," Agent Chen replied with satisfaction. "Once we present our evidence to the bank's legal department, they'll have no choice but to void the entire transaction. No legitimate financial institution wants to be seen as profiting from elder fraud, especially when their own employee was part of the conspiracy." As the federal agents prepared to leave, Agent Chen handed Clayton her business card and a victim services pamphlet. "Mr. Gilbert, you should know that your courage in coming forward has likely prevented other elderly residents from becoming victims of this same scheme. Walsh and his accomplices were getting bolder and more careless. If you hadn't fought back, they would have continued targeting seniors throughout Ohio." That evening, as Clayton sat in his kitchen reviewing the day's events with Frank and Eleanor, his phone rang with news that felt like the final piece of a complex puzzle clicking into place. Agent Chen's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had just won a significant victory. "Mr. Gilbert, I wanted to let you know personally, the federal grand jury has issued indictments for Marcus Gilbert, Vanessa Gilbert, and Kevin Walsh on multiple felony charges. Federal marshals will execute arrest warrants first thing tomorrow morning. Your ordeal is about to become their legal nightmare." Clayton hung up the phone and looked at his 2 closest friends, people who had stood by him when his own son had betrayed him. For the first time in days, he felt truly secure. The federal government was about to demonstrate what happened to criminals who targeted elderly Americans, and Clayton Gilbert was no longer a victim. He was a citizen whose rights had been violated and would now be protected by the full force of federal justice. Tomorrow morning, Marcus and Vanessa would discover that stealing from a retired carpenter in a small Ohio town had been the biggest mistake of their lives. Clayton was drinking his morning coffee when the first federal vehicle pulled into Marcus's driveway 3 blocks away. From his kitchen window, he couldn't see the arrest, but Eleanor called within minutes, with breathless updates from neighbors who had witnessed the entire operation. Federal marshals had arrived at dawn with arrest warrants, handcuffs, and the kind of professional efficiency that left no room for argument or escape. Mrs. Patterson saw them lead Marcus out in handcuffs. Eleanor reported, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and sadness for Clayton's sake. Vanessa was screaming about her rights and demanding a lawyer. The whole neighborhood was watching from their windows. Clayton felt an unexpected hollowness at the news. Despite everything Marcus had done, seeing his son arrested by federal agents was not the moment of triumph he had anticipated. Instead, it felt like the final death of a relationship that had been deteriorating for years, now ending not with reconciliation or understanding, but with handcuffs and federal charges. Agent Chen called an hour later with confirmation that all 3 conspirators were in federal custody. Walsh tried to run, she reported with professional satisfaction. Made it as far as the Columbus airport before airport security detained him on our warrant. All 3 are being held pending arraignment this afternoon. The federal courthouse in downtown Columbus was an imposing building that reflected the serious nature of the proceedings taking place within its walls. Clayton arrived with Frank Morrison and Eleanor Hayes, surprised to find several neighbors from Millbrook already present in the gallery. Word had spread through the community that one of their own was facing down criminals who had targeted elderly residents, and they had come to show support. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided over the arraignment with the no-nonsense authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with federal criminals. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she had heard every excuse and sob story that defense attorneys could devise. Marcus and Vanessa sat at the defendant's table with their court-appointed attorneys, both looking pale and diminished in orange jail uniforms. The expensive clothes and confident demeanor that had characterized their visit to Clayton's house had been replaced by the reality of federal detention. Kevin Walsh occupied a separate table with his own attorney, his banking career, and comfortable middle-class life, now reduced to plea negotiations and sentencing guidelines. The defendants have indicated their intention to accept plea agreements, Judge Hendricks announced after reviewing the charges. Mr. Walsh, you are pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit bank fraud, bribery, and violation of federal banking regulations. Is this correct? Walsh stood on shaking legs, his voice barely audible, as he confirmed his guilt. His attorney read a prepared statement acknowledging that Walsh had accepted bribes to approve fraudulent loans, had falsified income verification documents, and had violated every ethical standard of his profession. Judge Hendricks showed no mercy in her response. Mr. Walsh, your actions have undermined public trust in our banking system and specifically targeted elderly victims who relied on that system's integrity. I sentence you to 5 years in federal prison and permanent prohibition from employment in any financial institution. You will also pay full restitution to all victims of your schemes. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom as Walsh was led away, his banking career and reputation destroyed by his decision to profit from elder fraud. Marcus and Vanessa's plea hearing followed immediately. Their attorney attempted to portray them as victims of circumstance gambling, addiction, financial pressure, desperation driving them to poor decisions. But Judge Hendricks had reviewed the evidence of their sophisticated fraud scheme and was not impressed by excuses. Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert, she said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, you targeted your own family member, a 69-year-old widower, and used his identity to steal money that threatened his home and security. This represents a particularly cruel form of elder abuse that strikes at the foundation of family trust. Marcus suddenly stood up, ignoring his attorney's attempts to restrain him. Your Honor, may I speak to my father? Please, I need to ask his forgiveness. Clayton felt every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. This was the moment he had been dreading, the final test of his resolve to choose justice over misplaced mercy. Marcus looked genuinely remorseful, his face showing the weight of consequences he had never expected to face. Dad, please, Marcus called out, his voice breaking. I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt you terribly, but I'm still your son. Can't we find a way to work this out as a family? The courtroom fell silent as Clayton rose from his seat in the gallery. For a moment he looked at the son he had raised, the boy he had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework, the young man whose college education he had sacrificed to provide. Then he thought of Dorothy's final words of the forged signatures of the 30-day deadline that had threatened to destroy everything he and his wife had built together. "Marcus," Clayton said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "I spent 4 years trying to honor your mother's last wish to take care of you, but she never meant I should let you destroy me. You made your choice when you forged my signature. Now you have to live with the consequences of that choice." Marcus's face crumpled as he sat back down, the last hope of avoiding serious consequences disappearing with his father's words. Judge Hendricks nodded approvingly at Clayton before turning back to the defendants. "Marcus Gilbert and Vanessa Gilbert, I sentence you each to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will pay full restitution of $280,000 plus legal costs and victim compensation. Your actions represent a betrayal of family trust that demands serious consequences." The final gavel strike marked the end of a legal process that had transformed Clayton from victim to victor. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, Clayton felt not triumph, but a profound sense of closure. Justice had been served, his home was secure, and the community had witnessed what happened to criminals who targeted elderly residents. Frank Morrison squeezed Clayton's shoulder as they prepared to leave the courthouse. "Dorothy would be proud of you today," he said quietly. "You chose to protect yourself and other potential victims, instead of enabling destructive behavior." Eleanor took Clayton's other arm, her presence a reminder that his life was not ending with this courtroom victory, but beginning a new chapter. The federal justice system had vindicated his courage in fighting back, and the community had rallied around him in ways that proved family was not always defined by blood relationships. As they walked out of the federal courthouse into the bright Ohio sunshine, Clayton Gilbert was no longer a victim of fraud, but a survivor who had stood up to criminals and won. The gavel had fallen, justice had been served, and his future stretched ahead, with possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Clayton received the official letter he had been waiting for since the nightmare began. First National Bank of Columbus, in consultation with federal banking regulators, had formally voided the fraudulent loan and removed all liens against his property. The letter, signed by the bank's president and legal counsel, included a formal apology for their institution's role in the fraud and confirmation that Clayton Gilbert owned his home free and clear, with no outstanding obligations or encumbrances. Standing in his kitchen holding the letter that restored his complete financial security, Clayton felt a profound sense of relief that went beyond mere legal vindication. This was his home, the house he had renovated with his own hands, where he had raised his son and cared for his dying wife, where every board and nail represented decades of honest labor. No one could ever threaten it again. Frank Morrison arrived that afternoon with a bottle of champagne and news that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. "Clayton, you're going to be famous," he announced with obvious pride. "The Millbrook Gazette wants to do a feature story about your case, and the Ohio Craftsman Guild has voted to present you with their Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Restoration Arts." The newspaper article published the following week portrayed Clayton not as a victim, but as a hero who had stood up to sophisticated criminals and protected other elderly residents from similar fraud. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chen, no relation to the FBI agent, had interviewed several neighbors and community members who praised Clayton's courage and integrity. "Mr. Gilbert represents the best of our community values," Eleanor Hayes was quoted as saying. "He faced a terrible betrayal with dignity and strength, and his willingness to fight back has made all of us safer." The Craftsman Guild ceremony took place at the Millbrook Community Center on a crisp Saturday afternoon in November. Clayton stood before an audience of fellow artisans, neighbors, and friends as Guild President Robert Martinez presented him with a hand-carved walnut plaque recognizing 45 years of exceptional craftsmanship and dedication to preserving Ohio's architectural heritage. But it was Eleanor's presence beside him during the ceremony that meant the most. Over the weeks since the trial, their friendship had deepened into something neither had expected to find again at their age. She had been there for every difficult moment, organizing community support, attending court hearings, and providing the kind of steady companionship that made healing possible. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Clayton admitted to her as they walked home from the ceremony, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. "After Dorothy died, I assumed that chapter of my life was closed." Eleanor smiled, linking her arm through his with comfortable familiarity. "Dorothy wouldn't want you to stop living, Clayton. She'd want you to find happiness wherever you can for as long as you can. That evening, they sat on Clayton's front porch, making plans that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of fraud and betrayal. Eleanor had agreed to help him establish a workshop program for young people interested in learning traditional crafts. The community center had offered space, and several local high school students had already expressed interest in learning furniture restoration and decorative techniques. We could call it the Dorothy Gilbert Memorial Workshop, Eleanor suggested, a way to honor her memory while passing on your skills to the next generation. Clayton felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the mild November weather. Teaching young people his craft would give him purpose beyond his own projects, a way to ensure that traditional skills survived in an increasingly digital world. It would also be a fitting tribute to Dorothy, who had spent her career nurturing young minds as a schoolteacher. The next morning, Clayton drove to Millbrook Cemetery for the first time since the trial. He had avoided visiting Dorothy's grave during the crisis, feeling too ashamed and angry to face her memory while dealing with their son's betrayal. Now, with justice served and his future secure, he felt ready to have that conversation. Dorothy's headstone was simple granite, with her name dates and the inscription, "Beloved wife, mother, and teacher." Clayton knelt beside the grave and placed fresh chrysanthemums, her favorite autumn flowers, against the stone. "It's over, Dorothy," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the peaceful cemetery. "Marcus is in prison, but our home is safe. I kept my promise to take care of him, but I also learned to take care of myself. You would have been proud of how the community rallied around us." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around the grave, and Clayton could almost hear Dorothy's voice, telling him that love sometimes required difficult choices, that protecting himself had been the right decision. "I've met someone," he continued, feeling slightly awkward, but knowing Dorothy would want to know. "Eleanor Hayes. She's a librarian, like you always wanted to be. She's kind and intelligent, and she makes me laugh. I think you would have liked her." The conversation he had dreaded became a moment of peace and closure. Dorothy's memory would always be precious to him, but it no longer carried the weight of unfulfilled promises or unresolved guilt. He had honored her final wish by trying to help Marcus, but he had also honored her love for him by refusing to be destroyed by their son's choices. Walking back to his car, Clayton felt lighter than he had in years. The future stretched ahead with possibilities he was eager to explore, teaching workshops with Eleanor, traveling to craft shows they had discussed, maybe even writing a book about traditional restoration techniques. At 69, he was not ending his story, but beginning a new chapter. That afternoon, as he worked in his shop preparing materials for the first youth workshop, Clayton reflected on the lessons learned through his ordeal. True families supported rather than exploited each other. Love required boundaries to remain healthy. Community could provide strength that blood relations sometimes failed to offer. And justice, though sometimes slow and painful, ultimately protected the innocent and punished those who preyed on trust. The workshop door opened and Eleanor entered with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that promised many more shared afternoons ahead. Clayton Gilbert had survived betrayal, fought for justice, and discovered that new beginnings were possible at any age. The future was bright with promise, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we love most, but they also reveal the strength we never knew we possessed. Clayton Gilbert learned that true family isn't always defined by blood. It's found in the people who stand beside you when darkness falls, who believe in justice when others choose silence, and who celebrate your victories as their own. The scars of betrayal may never fully fade, but they can become reminders of our resilience rather than monuments to our pain. In choosing justice over misplaced loyalty, Clayton didn't lose a son. He discovered that he had been trying to save someone who was already lost. And in that painful recognition, he found the freedom to build new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. At 69, Clayton discovered that life's most beautiful chapters can begin when we least expect them. Love doesn't have an expiration date. Purpose can be rediscovered at any age, and communities still rally around those who stand up for what's right. His story reminds us that we're never too old to fight for justice, never too set in our ways to embrace new beginnings, and never too hurt to love again. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Your support helps us share more stories of courage, resilience, and the triumph of justice over deception.